Hey, you want to hear a joke? Sure. I told my house a joke during an earthquake. It cracked up. Yeah, that's it. Anyways, let's talk about earthquakes, specifically the history of earthquakes in Washington and how our response to them has changed over time. Our historical themes will be work, exchange, and technology, and the environment and geography. Our historical thinking skills will be continuity and change over time and causation. First, let's talk about what causes earthquakes and why Washington is especially vulnerable. The Earth is divided into several tectonic plates that are in constant motion, and this is due to convection currents beneath the Earth's crust. So here you can see that hot magma will rise from the core, and as it gets closer to the surface, it'll begin to cool, where it'll eventually fall down again. And this is what causes the tectonic plates to move. Now, these plates can move towards each other at convergent boundaries. And you can see convergent boundaries is where you'll see mountains forming. They can slide away from each other at divergent boundaries. Or they can slide past each other at transform boundaries. Now, earthquakes can happen at any of these boundaries, but they're most common at transform boundaries, since they slide past each other, but then they usually get caught in each other, because there's friction between them. And the force between them will just keep growing and growing until finally, boom, they split apart, and that's what causes the earthquake. Washington is especially vulnerable since we sit on some major faults. One of these major faults is the Cascadia subduction zone, which is the convergent boundary that's responsible for most of our earthquakes. Another interesting fact is that we sit on the infamous Pacific Ring of Fire, which is famous for its seismic activity. Over the last 5,500 years, megaquakes, or earthquakes with a magnitude of over 9, have occurred approximately every 365 to 405 years. Also, since the Cascadia subduction zone is under the sea, seismic activity here often causes tsunamis as well. Now that we've got a basic understanding of why earthquakes work, let's get to the real fun part: history. You see this timeline here? As we walk down the path of time, let's fill this thing in. The first people to face the quakes in Washington were the Quakers. No, I'm joking. Those were completely different. The first people to face earthquakes in Washington were, of course, the indigenous Native Americans. In the interest of time, we'll consider the latest megaquake, which happened 1700, January 26th at 9 p.m. Hey, 1700? And earthquakes occur every 365 to 405 years? We're due for another earthquake sometime this century. Now, I know what you're thinking. Akash, what are you talking about? I mean, if it's 1700, then there were probably already a bunch of colonists in the Americas by this time. But that's not true. At least for the Pacific Northwest it wasn't. See, Spanish settlers first arrived in the Pacific Northwest in the year 1774, and they were followed by British colonists in 1778, and this was more than 70 years after the earthquake happened. So yes, the indigenous Native Americans were in fact the only ones to deal with this earthquake at this time. The incredible specificity of the timing of the earthquake was possible due to the collaboration of Japanese seismologists and the oral traditions of Native Americans. We have some representatives here. Hello, I am a Japanese seismologist. So you want to hear about the earthquake of the 1700? Yes, this earthquake originated at the Cascadia subduction zone, but it eventually became the cause of what became known as the Great Orphan Earthquake of Japan, which flooded the coastal cities the day after the earthquake happened. Now, through extensive research, which you can see here, we have determined that this earthquake was a megathrust earthquake of magnitude 9. So, hey, you're not Native American. Aren't you an Indian? So, I thought you needed Indians. I said American Indians. That's probably the same thing. Yeah, you're right. Go on. We tell stories telling about the horror of the earthquakes. According to this website, our oral traditions, the tsunamis were around 20 to 30 feet high. We've been able to keep track of roughly how long ago it was by counting the number of generations since the event occurred. Now, how hard you got hit generally depended on your housing. If you had light housing, like teepees, like the Yakima people, it generally wasn't too bad. If you had heavy plank houses like the Chinook, then it was hard because of two things. A, it was just more dangerous to be in a heavy house like that. And B, you usually had all your belongings in that house. So when all that stuff got washed away, it made it hard to recover. If you had heavy stone housing, it was even worse. Earthquakes were a two-pronged attack, first with the shaking of the land, and then with the tsunami that followed. They destroyed houses and crops, caused landslides, and killed the salmon and shellfish, which Pacific populations relied heavily on. In order to rationalize these terrible events, our ancestors created stories to explain why they happened. The Tolowa believed that the tsunamis cleansed the earth, leaving only the chosen people to live. The Yurok of the Klamath River believed that the mighty earthquake, along with his friend Thunder, carved out the estuaries that allow our fish and wildlife to thrive. I will tell you one more such story. The story of Thunderbird of the Sky and Whale of the Sea.
Whoa. You're gonna tell us a story?
Yeah. Why not?
Why don't you try something a little more trendy and hip-hop?
Like what?
You could try rapping?
Yeah. I could do that. Alright. Thunderbird of the Sky and Whale of the Sea. Rap style.
Thunderbird, protector of the sky, saw a whale wreaking havoc, causing waves to rise. The ocean was wild, balance thrown off track, and nature's peace, well, it was never coming back. Thunderbirds are red, talons like knives, he swooped down ready to change their lives. Whales stirred the waters deep and loud, Thunderbird's power was about to be crowned. They clashed in the sky and the sea hit the shore. The earth that shook hard couldn't take much more. Mountains shook and rivers they roared. The world went silent, then thunder poured. Battle raged on and days turned to weeks. Every move a quake beneath their feet. Tsunamis crashed and the skies went darker, trembled as they left their mark. Thunderbird lifted whale to the sky. The ocean screamed as they reached up high. With one mighty swoop, Thunderbird was crowned. Balance restored, peace spread all around. But deep below, the whale still stirs. Every time it moves, the earth it blurs. Thunderbird rises back to the scene. Their battle's a cycle, so very clean. So when the ground shakes and the waves crash loud, remember the story that lives in the crowd. Thunderbird and whale locked in that dance, shaking the earth with every chance.
Dang, that was fire! Yes, sir. Alright, now back to the timeline. Now that we know a little bit about how Native Americans dealt with the earthquakes, let's get a little more modern. Our next major development occurs not in Washington, but in Lisbon, Portugal, where in the year of 1755, an earthquake nearly destroyed the entire city. Soon after that, in the year of 1783, England was hit with 5 uncharacteristically strong earthquakes. It was these 2 events that drove the creation of the science of seismology as we know it today. The Lisbon earthquake killed nearly 70,000 people and leveled the entire city. Wow, earthquakes are scary. I guess you could say they have me shaking. Before this earthquake, scientists in Europe often looked towards Aristotle's teachings when trying to understand why earthquakes happened. Now, Aristotle believed that earthquakes were caused by sudden uprisings of wind beneath the Earth's surface. Now, while his reasoning was faulty, it was slightly more scientific than the thoughts of ancient humans, who, like the Native Americans, often thought there was some kind of restless creature beneath the Earth that occasionally stirred up, causing the earthquakes. Inspired by the Enlightenment era and the loss from Lisbon in Portugal, pioneers like John Mitchell of England and Elie Bertrand of Switzerland began to study the location, timing, and effects of earthquakes. As the 1800s came around, communication with various scientists from around the world became much more common. In 1819, a quake in Kutch, India revealed evidence of faults through exposure of the Allah Band fault. In 1822, Maria Graham reported changes in the Chilean coastline following earthquakes. In 1830, Charles Lyell published his first version of the Principles of Geology. In the late 1800s, Robert Mallet became a prominent figure in the world of seismology. Originally a civil engineer who designed many of London's bridges, he was the first to develop a method to estimate the speed of seismic waves using gunpowder. The same method is still used today in oil field exploration. He was also the first to estimate the depth of an earthquake underground. At the same time, Alexis Perry of France began to catalog earthquakes, looking for correlations in the seasons and the lunar calendar. In Italy, Luigi Palmiri invented an electromagnetic seismograph that was capable of detecting earthquakes that were imperceptible to humans. Back in America, we had the North Cascades earthquake of 1872, which had an estimated magnitude of 6.5 to 7.0. Following this earthquake, Grove Carl Gilbert made the groundbreaking discovery that faults weren't in fact a secondary feature of earthquakes, but a primary one. Before this, scientists thought that earthquakes were explosions in the ground, and that faults were caused by these explosions. Harry Fielding Reid built upon Gilbert's work. Wait, built upon? Let's hope the earthquakes don't knock this building down.
From the screen to the ring to the pen to the king. Where's my crown?
Anyways, Reed decided that earthquakes were the result of sudden release of stress between the Earth's plates, which was later supported by Alfred Wegener's establishment of plate tectonic theory. Our next two major earthquakes are the 1949 Olympia earthquake, which had a magnitude of 6.7 and resulted in 8 deaths and $25 million lost in damages, and the 1965 Puget Sound earthquake, which also had a magnitude of 6.7 and resulted in 7 deaths and $12.5 million lost in damages, and this accelerated efforts to map out seismic hazards. Following these two earthquakes, Washington adopted building standards to reduce structural vulnerability. The next major earthquake was the Nisqually earthquake of 2001, which had a magnitude of 6.8 and resulted in 400 injuries and $1 to $4 billion lost in damages. It demonstrated the importance of seismic retrofitting for infrastructure. Following this earthquake, a series of reformations surrounding policies about seismic activity took place. The first of these was the Great Washington Shakeout, which was a drill that started in 2008 and educated the public about earthquake safety, having over 1 million participants annually. Secondly, in 2015, Washington allocated $4.6 million to LiDAR technology, allowing us to map out geologic hazards and improve predictive capabilities for landslides, earthquakes, and tsunamis. The Resilient Earthquake Initiative of 2015 helped to refine evacuation routes for earthquakes and also helped in the planning of post-earthquake recovery strategies. Project Safe Haven of 2016 integrated high ground to tsunami-prone coastal communities, starting with Ocosta Elementary in 2016. Also in 2016, updated building codes added reinforcement to vertical elements and also special inspections. Speaking of reinforcements, how do earthquake-proof buildings work?
Method number 1 applies to smaller residential buildings that have 1 to 2 floors, which should be built of a sturdy wood or even concrete rather than something like stone. This is because while wood is flexible and can sway, just like this, something as rigid as stone only has 2 positions, upright like this picture, or fallen over once the earthquake strikes. Method number 2 is the use of dampeners, as seen in this picture. You can use springs, just like this tower right here, or you can use giant pendulums. When the tower begins to swing, the inertia of the pendulum makes it swing the other way. This will eventually bring the tower back to its original position. One final example of dampeners is the use of a tower within a tower, which effectively functions the same way as the pendulum. Finally, method number 3 is to disconnect the tower from the earth, and rather put it on some rubber pads that disconnect it from the earth and allow it to sway independently, rather than crashing down when the earth shakes.
Infrastructure alone isn't enough to protect us though. We also need predictive capabilities. Thanks to new technologies, we now have the ability to predict several different scenarios for what might happen if an earthquake of that magnitude were to hit that area, what kind of damages we might incur, things like that. However, we still don't have the ability to tell whether an earthquake is actually going to happen. The reason for that is that the forces that culminate into an earthquake accumulate over hundreds of years, so our technology just isn't sensitive enough to pick up that kind of information. We can, however, detect the P waves that are released by earthquakes. When earthquakes happen, they release 2 types of waves: longitudinal P waves, which are light and travel like this, and transversal S waves, which are heavy and dangerous. Since P waves are lighter, they travel faster, and where we have the technology to pick them up, we can tell that P waves are there, and therefore more dangerous S waves are coming. This lets us know that the S waves are on their way more than a minute in advance.
And that leaves just one more question. What can we do to keep ourselves safe? An earthquake hit. Fortunately, John was prepared.
Alright, let's talk about our earthquake evacuation plan. If there's ever an earthquake and you're not at home, we'll text each other to make sure we're all okay. If we are at home, we'll meet at the big tree outside. See this? This is the route we're gonna take.
Well, what if we're at school?
That's a great question. If you're at school, stay put until it's safe to leave.
John made sure his supply kit was stocked with essentials, like gloves, a whistle, documents, sturdy shoes, and even a fire extinguisher. He also makes sure he knows where all the utility valves are.
Okay, John, you can do this. Remember, stop, drop, and hold. Oh, it's time to text the family to make sure they're safe.
Jack knows that texts often go through when calls don't. Jack also pulls out his portable radio so that he's updated on the situation. Be like Jack. Stay safe.
From the screen to the ring to the pen to the king. Where's my crown? That's my bling.